So my name is James Rucker. I'm a psychiatrist. I'm also, as Phil said, a lecturer. And over the past few years, I've been working with David Nutt and Robin Carhart-Harris at Imperial College London on their psychedelic studies. Now, because I'm a psychiatrist, I'm interested in the therapeutic utility of these drugs rather than the neuroimaging, and that's what I'm going to tell you about today. There's a few questions I'm going to try and answer. First is who am I, and who do I work for? I've just told you that. Why I'm interested in psychedelics. I was going to tell you then about the trial that we've just finished using psilocybin in people with treatment-resistant depression. I'm going to show you the results of that. That's going to be announced next month. And I'm going to have a discussion about how I think they might work. And then I'm going to throw a couple of questions open to you for a sort of broader discussion. And please stop me if you have any questions. I'd like it to be quite interactive, so I'm not going to talk for too long, probably about half an hour or so. So yeah, when I came on the plane, they took my laser pointer off me because they said I might shine it in someone's eye. So I can't point, but this lovely looking place down here is where I work 4 days a week. And this is one of the old asylums, one of the last working old asylums in the UK. It's called Springfield. And the style of psychiatry that I practice there is very different to the style of psychiatry and psychotherapy that I practice in the clinical trial with psilocybin and depression. But I just wanted to make that point that actually most of the time I'm having to occupy two camps because the style of interaction with mental health that I have in the NHS is it's much more brutal. There's a lot more medication, there's a lot more coercion. And that's partly why I became so interested in psychedelics, because I felt quite unhappy with that model. And I was looking for something different. And the picture you see at the top, that is Robin and David Nutt's team. And they are all the people who helped do the psilocybin and depression study. You'll see Robin on the right and me in the middle somewhere. And the majority, they are psychiatrists, they're psychologists, they're psychotherapists, and academic researchers as well. But when we talk about me and psychedelics, I kind of, it's perhaps unusual for a psychiatrist to be interested in psychedelics, and the reason for that is, well, we're told that psychedelics are bad, and generally speaking, being at the sort of coalface of NHS mental health, you see an awful lot of people who have taken a lot of drugs and have started behaving in a very unusual way. And I'm not saying that the drugs are causing that, incidentally, but it is understandable that a lot of psychiatrists think that drugs cause mental illness. And so we are quite naturally biased against certain forms of drugs. And I think psychedelics are one of those. But I first came across psychedelics at music festivals. And this is the Boom Festival in Portugal. And what fascinated me about it was that it completely challenged my view of what psychedelics were meant to do. I thought they were meant to send you psychotic, and actually I saw people having a good time, but also people the next day seeming an awful lot clearer about who they were and what they were doing. And I thought to myself as a psychiatrist, why on earth are we not exploiting this? Why are we not talking about this? Why are we not researching this? But at the time, I was doing a genetics PhD. And if you ever want easy research money, then go into genetics. It's I would imagine the reason why there's so much money in genetics is that somehow we feel that genes have the answer, that they're somehow going to explain our ills, why we suffer. After 2-3 years of doing a genetics PhD, I realised that this was not the case, and that genes were so far away from the patients that I was dealing with, that I was dealing with, that it didn't feel satisfying for me anymore, and I wanted to find something different. And it was at that point that I met this chap in the bottom left-hand corner, who's called David Arizzo. This picture is from his study, and it shows the distribution of the 5-HT2A receptor in the cortex. And I got talking to him about psychedelics, and I resolved to myself that when I'd finished my genetics PhD, that I would start to inquire more into this. And I went off travelling after my PhD, and had a good think, and decided when I came back to contact this chap in the top left-hand corner, who's called David Nutt. And I went for a meeting with him and Robin, and it was just at that point when they were setting up the psilocybin in depression trial, and that was about 3 years ago. And the chap in the bottom left, he's the guy who put together the music that's been playing. He's called Mendel Kaelen, so I just thought I'd pop him in there, because it's a wonderful playlist. The playlist that he put together is the one that we use in the psilocybin in depression trial, that the participants trip to, which I'll talk a bit more about in a while. But one of the extraordinary things about the psilocybin in depression trial is this. Robin and David applied for a grant from the UK government, from the Medical Research Council, which is funded by the UK government. And the Medical Research Council, being independent of the UK government, as in sort of not directly influenced by them, they won the grant. And it was for 3 years and for £500,000. And I met David right at the end. And he said, "You know what? We haven't seen a single person yet." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "We've spent the whole time going through the government's own bureaucracy to use the drug." If you just think about the perversity of that, the government were paying him to go through the government's own bureaucracy, and they spent all the money doing that. And at that point, probably as a result of that, I wrote this article I initially just wrote it out of frustration and anger, and then I showed it to David, and he said, you should submit this somewhere. So I thought, well, where's a relatively high-profile journal? So I sent it to the British Medical Journal, not thinking that they would be interested, and they were very interested in it, mostly because they knew that it would get them a lot of website hits. And they published it, and I then had 10 days of people from all over the world getting in touch with me. I was amazed at the reaction that this article had. It was only a couple of pages long, and in it I basically said, look, we can't go on like this. We can't research these drugs within the current legal climate. These drugs are more legally restricted than heroin and cocaine. It means no doctor that can prescribe them without a special license. It means that the stigma that's built up over the years is making it very, very hard to get ethical approval for studies. It's making it very hard to get grants, and it's making the drugs themselves incredibly expensive to buy. And I asked for them to be downgraded from the UN Schedule 1 to UN Schedule 2. And UN Schedule 2 is where drugs like heroin and cocaine are scheduled. And the reason why they're scheduled is because they have an identified medical use. Schedule 1 indicates they have no accepted medical use. A bit more about that in a while. Anyway, there was an awful lot of reaction to this article, and it showed me how much tacit interest there is out there. I mean, you don't hear people talking about psychedelic drugs independently, but as soon as someone sort of sticks their head above the parapet and says something, quite a lot of attention seems to be paid. And we've seen that with Robin's LSD study research the other week. What was amusing about it for me is that I got labelled as a leading psychiatrist and a top UK psychiatrist. I'm actually still a trainee, albeit a senior trainee. But I mean, this article went to a lot of quite sort of high-profile places, and it really surprised me, and it just showed me how much interest there is out there about psychedelics. But the stigma that has been building for the past 30, 40, 50 years since Prohibition means that it's a taboo subject that people don't really talk about. And it's culminated. The best article that was written for me was an article by the Daily Mash, which is a satirical take on the news in the UK, and in it they played on the fact that magic mushrooms might help people hallucinate home ownership. And as you might know, everyone in the UK aspires to own their own home, but because of that, it makes the house prices incredibly high, and ironically, very few people can afford to buy their own home. But if you take magic mushrooms, obviously, then you can hallucinate it for yourself. But I suppose all that interest said that no one was really talking about psychedelics. And of course, this goes all the way back to the 70s, and the late 80s, 70s, and the Vietnam War. And psychedelics were banned for two reasons. There was medical concern about the drugs, it is true. Not about their physiological safety, not about their use in controlled settings, but there was concern about their use in recreational settings and occasional toxic reactions, toxic psychological reactions in psychologically destabilizing environments, shall we say. But it was dressed up as though it was, concern for the medical harms of the drugs, but it wasn't. And the guy in 1992, John Ehrlichman, who was Richard Nixon's domestic policy advisor, in 1992 he had a spell in prison after the Watergate scandal. He wasn't doing much, and I think he was unwell by that time. He died 7 years later, but he was interviewed by a guy called Dan Baum, and I was going to read the quote to you, because Dan Baum was asking him about the war on drugs, and why the Nixon administration decided to do this. And he goes, "You want to know what this was really all about?" he asked with the bluntness of a man who, after public disgrace and a stretch in federal prison, had little left to protect. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalising both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So there is an example of political power mongering, and I would say that we are suffering the consequences of it 50 years later. And it was me finding out about this and me being a psychiatrist and therefore in a position to question the status quo, that this is what led me to do it. But of course, politicians do have control over the media, and there was some extraordinary headlines of the time. And you laugh. I mean, obviously they're ridiculous, but the thing is that it does kind of inculcate an attitude to the drugs. It feeds a stigma. So ridiculous as though they may be, I think many people today are frightened of many people today are frightened of psychedelics because of headlines like this, and the lessons they subsequently taught their children. But you know what? I mean, it's interesting because Robin released his research last week, and what should appear a few days later? You know, so the same thing is still going on. We have to be very mindful of things like this. There is still a very ingrained reaction to these drugs. And people will be on the lookout for things going wrong and will use it to evidence their prejudices against it. So for me, there needs to be a slow accrual of scientific evidence. And that's what I'm going to tell you about in a second. This is a busy slide, you don't need to take much notice of it. I went through all the pre-prohibition literature recently, and it's terrible. The methodology is awful. Sometimes they don't even report how many patients they treat, let alone what their diagnoses are and what their outcomes are. But in synthesizing it, you could come to this view that nearly 80% of the people were judged to have improved, in inverted commas. They often didn't define that. Ranging in the various studies from 40 to 95%. That alone indicates that probably there is a reason to be looking at these drugs again. And this is what Psychedelics, which is the study I've been involved with, is all about. It is a pilot study of Psilocybin, which is the active component of magic mushrooms in resistant depression. I've told you about the perversities of its funding. We finished it just last month, so a year and a bit late. There were 12 patients, all had treatment-resistant depression. They'd failed at least 2 medical psychological therapies. We excluded people with histories of psychosis or family histories of psychosis, serious suicide attempts or violence to others. They were given 6 sessions. 2 of those were drug sessions. So they had 2 preparatory sessions where we got to know them, 2 drug sessions which lasted between 6 and 8 hours, and then 2 reintegration sessions afterwards, again, that each lasted 2 hours. There were 2 guides for all the sessions, and there was always a medical doctor there. And they had neuroimaging before session 2 and before the final session. And then we followed them up for 3 months afterwards. This just shows you how many people expressed an interest and how many people ended up being recruited. Generally speaking, people were either excluded because of the exclusion criteria that I told you about, or because they weren't depressed enough and hadn't failed enough treatments already. And this is where we did it. It's the Imperial College London research facility. And the reason why I'm showing you these pictures, it's basically like a hospital ward. I mean, it is a ward in a hospital. But is this the sort of place you'd want to trip? And here's this guy. I mean, so we had a bit of a job on our hands to because we're very aware that the context is incredibly important. So we transformed these hospital side rooms into something like this, which is a bit nicer. And I mean, in many ways, I think if I get this research going again, it would be nice to have access to nature. I think that's probably the most important thing. But here, being in a hospital ward, there was no chance of that. And the one thing that we couldn't let the patients do is leave. That was stipulated by the ethics committee. They had to have 2 people with them at all times. So we tried to create as nice an environment as we could, and that's David and Roz with someone during one of their drug sessions, and we played them the music that Mendel curated, and we generally encouraged them to go inwardly, to use the eye mask. But if they wanted to talk, then we were there to support them. But that was very much the emphasis. It was on supporting them through their journey, whatever that happened to be, and whatever they needed to do, we would help them do that. So these are the people who went through the study, and there's just a couple of things to say. The first is they had generally been depressed for a long period of time, more than perhaps the selection criteria would suggest. They were generally in their 30s, 40s, 50s. There was one lady in her 60s. Only half of them, I think, had tried psychedelics before. So, is it half of them? Yeah, no, 7 of them. So the majority was psychedelic naive. And these were the results. So this is, the QIDS is a patient-rated depression rating scale for the way you feel. So you've got baseline on the left. You've got 1 week post the second treatment, the second drug session, and then periods up to 3 months after that. Cohen's D is just a standardized measure of effect, and the star indicates that it's statistically significant at the 0.01 level. So this is highly significant. Remember, this is just 2 drug treatments for people who are highly resistant to other forms of treatment. And what we found was that the antidepressant effects extended for up to 3 months, but it was starting to tail off after 3 months. Still, this is an awful lot better than ketamine therapy. And looking at the clinician-rated depression severities, you see a relatively similar thing. It would be unusual and you would be suspicious if the majority of people miraculously got better, and some of them didn't. Everyone improved. That usually happens with treatments for depression. Everyone improved, but not everyone reached remission. And remission is the yellow bit at the bottom. But I think 6 of the people at 3 months were depression-free. So half of them were depression-free.
James, quick question.
Yeah.
Was it incorporated into the therapy, or I might have missed that, or was it just in one administration with the supervision? Was the administration of psilocybin incorporated into the therapy or something?
So there were 6 sessions, 2 preparatory sessions, where we get to know them. 2 drug sessions, one with a low dose of psilocybin, 10 milligrams. I found that at that dose, a lot of people weren't getting much effect, but what tended to happen was a sort of a catalyzation, if there's a word like that, of the relationship between us, between the patient and the therapist, and it was usually about trust. It was usually about, can I tell you my stuff? Can I behave in this way, and you will accept it? And it was the first session was incredibly valuable from that point of view, because we often got to know them at a much deeper level during that first session, because it's not a high enough dose to stop people being able to talk or express themselves succinctly, but I think it was a high enough dose to, as I say, catalyze the relationship between us. Then the second dose was 25 milligrams, and that's where we tended to see the much more interesting, symbolic, material. You've got your hand up. Yeah.
Yeah. How much would that equate to in like dried mushroom dose?
Yeah. So 10 milligrams equates to a gram of dried cubensis, psilocybe cubensis. So 2.5 grams, 25 milligrams. It's fairly equivalent dose, I would say. So the fourth session was when they had the high dose, and that was when we tended to see quite interesting symbolic material. An example was a chap who had been abused by his father and had the image in his mind of a horse rearing up with a gun, and the face of the horse turned away. And I always remember his trip because he was curled up like a child whilst he was experiencing that. And then we supported him through that. We supported him to go and look at the face of the horse, to go round in his mind's eye and go and look at the face of the horse. And he went round and he did that, and he started laughing. And at that point, the trip flipped, and he was euphoric. And he did very well. I can't tell you, a lot about these people because it would not be fair on them. I interpreted the horse and the gun as being sort of symbolic of his father, and the gun as that's the penis. And him going round to face the horse was about him facing the unresolved emotional trauma and conflict from when he was abused. And he's continued to do extremely well. And the reason why he's continued to do extremely well is not so much that experience itself, but because it sowed a seed. It sowed a seed about being interested in the way his mind would occasionally throw up representations of his past. He would be open to that, and he would be prepared to interpret that. And the reason I think why he's done so well over the year is because he sort of nurtured that seed and it's grown. And that's what we want to try and do. We want to try and help people to turn inwardly and look at their experience with a friendly smile, whatever it is, to have compassion for themselves and for their narratives of who they are. Because I think ultimately that's what we all have to do. And what I hope the psychedelic represents is something that catalyses that. But it is not in and of itself therapeutic. It depends on the context. And that's why we tried to create the warm environment that's not the hospital ward. And that's why we tried to emphasize that our role was about support, and it was about a non-judgmental approach to whatever it was that they wanted to bring up, and that we would be compassionate to that. So inculcating the same attitude, having the same attitude to them that we wanted to them to develop for themselves, for their narratives, for their feelings, for their memories. And that is, in many ways, a paradigm shift for me away from what psychiatry normally is. A lot of the time we're prescribing medications to suppress people's feelings and emotions. I think there are an awful lot of people who it would be far more powerful to teach them this inwardly directed compassion. This is just to say that by whatever way we measured it lots of different ways, they did very well, generally speaking. There's a few things to say about this trial. Obviously, it's a pilot study. Everyone knows what they're getting. Generally speaking, the people who got into the trial were looking for something. They were desperate for something to help. Maybe they had the prior expectation that psychedelics would help. So there's all that in the mix. So we might not expect these sorts of wonderful results in the long term. But it's definitely an indication that we should be looking, that we should be doing further research. So how do we think psychedelics might be working in the brain? Well, the commonality in psychedelics is serotonin. They all of the classical psychedelics share a chemical structure that is quite similar to the tryptamine substructure of serotonin. But there are 14 different types of serotonin receptor in the brain. But what you find is that as the stickiness for a chemical for a certain type of serotonin receptor increases, so does its ability to cause a psychedelic effect. That's what you see in diagram 1. So that indicates that this subtype of the 5-HT receptor called 5-HT2A receptor is probably involved. Similarly, and in the bottom left-hand corner, if you block that receptor, it abolishes the psychedelic effect. People no longer experience it. In the top right, you have that picture again from David Arizzo, and that shows you where 5-HT2A is expressed in the brain. And it is in predominantly, almost completely, in fact, in the cortex, in the bit of our brain that thinks and is accountable for our humanness. And in the bottom right, you see 5-HT2A that's being lit up with this green dye on a certain type of neuron. And these are fascinating neurons. They're called layer 5 pyramidal neurons. They're incredibly complicated, and they sit right at the top of the cortical chain. When we think about the way our brain generates reality, what it tends to do is it takes a mixture of our sensory information, and it uses expectation to work out the likelihood of what that sensory information represents. What these little green neurons here represent, in my mind, are those expectations. Reality is somewhere in the middle of the sensory information that comes in and the expectations that we place upon it. Now, when we're thinking about the way psychedelics work, what we are wondering is whether or not by disrupting these neurons, by stimulating 5-HT2A on these neurons, that we're affecting the expectations that we place on certain sensory information, the information that's coming in. And when we look at neuroimaging studies of the brain, we find if we're just looking for changes where under psilocybin we see changes in blood flow, which is a proxy measure of activity. When we look at that, what we see, if you look at the top left-hand diagram, the brain image, that's probably the most indicative one. You're looking at the brain sort of side on there, it's like it's being sliced down through the nose. And you see this blue blob at the back and this blue blob at the front. And these are key integrator hubs. They integrate information. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Otto was the first one.
Yeah, just the blocking study or research, was that psilocybin or LSD or both, or which compounds? Like when you saw that there was nothing happening when that receptor was blocked.
It doesn't matter what psychedelic you use.
So it has been tested with ayahuasca too?
Yeah. It doesn't matter what psychedelic you use. It blocks the core psychedelic effect. It seems that the 5-HT2A receptor is necessary, no matter what psychedelic you take. Of the classical psychedelics, obviously there are lots of compounds we might label as psychedelic, like ketamine and salvia. They have different mechanisms of action, but also don't have the classical psychedelic effect.
I have a
Yeah.
Have you done any studies with placebo? That you have given one group psychedelics and one group not?
That's next.
That's next.
Yes. The problem with those studies is it's perfectly obvious when someone is on psychedelics. You can't blind. You couldn't blind me to whether or not someone's on the psychedelic, and you certainly can't blind the person. So placebo, we will do the placebo control thing, but it's inherently quite difficult and it's inherently flawed. We can talk more about that afterwards if you like. We are going to do it though. But going back to the blue blobs, these bits on the top left, these are key integrator hubs of the brain. They are where your brain takes different types of information and integrates them into a conceptual whole. And it seems to be these bits that are suppressed on psychedelics. And that might underlie the fact that the expectation, that we dissolve away expectations on psychedelics. We dissolve away the thinking I, the ego, and that this may be a therapeutic effect of psychedelics. It's worth saying that the blob at the front has been consistently shown to be overactive in depression, and particularly in depression where people ruminate. They constantly think, they overthink negatively. Here we have evidence that psychedelics are suppressing that. And so, as I've indicated, what we're talking about, I suppose, is the interaction between our thinking and our feeling brain. And more than that, this is a picture of me, incidentally, when I was a baby. In thinking about the brain, we're not born with a blank slate, but we're kind of born with a blank slate. And we teach ourselves how to think from our environment. So we learn from the people around us how to think. And as time goes on, I mean, you know children, they're a ragbag of emotions and they don't think straight. But over time they do. Because if given the right care early on, the right peer relationships and experiences, education, then their brain develops in a way that is adaptive to their society. They integrate their emotions into a whole. They segregate ideas appropriately. Well, they become like me, looking slightly bonkers in a bindi. But I suppose even though this process occurs over time, what we need to retain is a flexibility. A flexibility to change our templates of interacting with the world and of interacting with people that we have learned before. And the way I think psychedelics may work is that they help us to break apart these templates when they are not working so well. Because oftentimes, I think especially neurotic types of mental illness, we get templates of interacting with the world or with people that are applied again and again and again and again, even though they don't work. We've somehow lost the flexibility to adapt our templates. And I'm going to end with a few quotes before I open up the discussion. And this is George Bernard Shaw, who's a famous playwright. And he said, "Those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything." And I think that's what he was getting at, was people who can't flexibly change the templates that they use to interact with people and with the world, can't really change anything. They remain stuck in their view of the world and of themselves. Sigmund Freud, who's the father of psychoanalysis, wanted to change people's minds by making them aware of the unconscious, but he was also aware that that drugs might play a role with that. And he said the future may teach us how to exercise a direct influence by means of particular chemical substances upon the neural apparatus. It may be that there are other still undreamt of possibilities of therapy. And this is Humphrey Osmond, who's one of the first psychiatrists to use LSD therapeutically. And he put it very well. He said, "Our beliefs greatly influence the world in which we live. That world is in part, at least, what we make of it. Once our mould for world making is formed, it most strongly resists change." Here I think he's talking about the templates that we develop as children. The psychedelics allow us for a little while to divest ourselves of these acquired assumptions and to see the universe again with an innocent eye. But then that idea that we can break down our templates, that we can break down our expectations about this top-level, top-down control over our experience is probably present naturally in all of us to an extent, and in some of us more than others. And it's arguable, perhaps, that psychosis is that happening naturally. It is, if you like, the brain's attempt to break down its templates in response to a changing environment and rebuild them again. And that probably happens naturally in some people. And this is William Blake, who is, well, I mean, when he was alive, he was considered mad. He died unknown, but he's now considered one of the greatest poets and artists of our time and a prophetic visionary. And he said, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. And I think what he was referring to is the top-down control that we can place upon experience and that we learn to apply over the years as we grow up from children. And this is William James, and he wrote in The Varieties of Religious Experience. He was an American philosopher and psychologist. He said, our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness as we call it, is but one special type of consciousness, whilst all about it, parted from it by the flimsiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. We may go through life without suspecting their existence, but apply the requisite stimulus, and at a touch, they are there in all their completeness, definite types of mentality which probably somewhere have had their field of application and adaptation. No account of the universe in its totality can be final, which leaves these other forms of consciousness quite disregarded. And this is Aldous Huxley, the 50s author, and he was very taken by William Blake's Doors of Perception quote. And he wrote in his book, The Doors of Perception, there are things known and there are things unknown, and in between there are the doors of perception. And it's this idea that the brain acts as a sort of reducing valve for our experience, and that psychedelics may open that. And that in exposing us to that, it allows us to see things from a different perspective, by exposing us to new and different forms of consciousness, that we may start to let go of concerns that before have ruminated and gone around our minds. So I end with a couple of questions, because I've been talking rather longer than I anticipated. And I'd ask you to consider, can psychedelics help us change our minds by exposing us to different modes of consciousness? And what I alluded to before, does psychosis exist as one mechanism of adaptation to a changing environment? So I'll stop there. Please, I don't know whether we probably can't pass the microphone around, can we? But I'd just like to have a discussion with you all about your view of psychedelics, because it's a lovely crowd to talk to. I'm sure you're quite sympathetic, but I know there are very many different views of how these drugs work and how they may be helpful. So yeah, at that point I'll stop, and thank you very much for listening. And yeah, chap over there.
Yeah, so you spoke at the end about breaking down templates. And my question becomes, so you break down templates, so obviously when you break down the templates that don't work now, because many of your templates do work quite well.
Yeah.
So when does that happen? Do you think, break down those templates and work before, consciously or subconsciously, or can you identify the problematic templates as a part of the psychedelic experience?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean, I think, I suppose broadly speaking, the psychedelic is going to, it's probably going to break down many templates, isn't it? But what you would imagine is that the ones that are adaptive will reform again. But the ones that are maladaptive, if you've broken it down enough, hopefully you will get something that reforms that is more adaptive in its place. That's the way I would see it working. Yeah, Annie.
Yeah, I was thinking about children. You talk about the child being plastic.
Yeah.
That they have plasticity.
Yeah.
I was thinking maybe what happens in the brain is that the psychedelics actually trigger some kind of instant plasticity.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I mean,
I would say that that's how it, I would say yes, it does help us.
Yes.
Exposing us to.
Yes, I think in sort of breaking down our learned thinking patterns, if you like, or this top-down level of control, the brain temporarily regresses back to a childlike state of adaptation. And that is why the context and the environment are so important. And that is why people in psychologically destabilizing environments can have awful experiences. Because the environment is not right. And they behave perhaps like a child would in those situations. They're frightened and confused. But if you have the right setting, supportive, nurturing, compassionate, then that inculcates the rebuilding of templates which are adaptive. The re-establishment of an adult sense of thinking, but without, hopefully, these stuck, negative, maladaptive templates of interaction that have been being repeated over and over without being modified.
Can I just clear that two words about plasticity? I happen to be involved in the research of brain plasticity for a little while, and what is fascinating, at least for me, was that when I started doing literature search, there are several studies clearly demonstrating that a single administration of a classic psychedelic like LSD and psilocybin produce dramatic expression of plasticity markers like art, for example. Moreover, there is a recent, relatively, well, it's not recent, it has been published in 2011, review by Harvey of animal studies of 5-HT2A agonists like LSD and other classic psychedelics, clearly demonstrating that they enhance learning in animals, for example. So yeah, well, there are several studies demonstrating that the levels of the BDNF, well, neocortical levels of BDNF, this is one of the markers of, and there's of brain plasticity is getting doubled on the psychedelic. So I think there are different indications that they may boost plasticity, both cognitive plasticity and perhaps neurobiological plasticity. Moreover, it is known that therapeutic interventions are more effective during the so-called psychedelic afterglow, several weeks after the psychedelic experience.
Mm.
You can also mention the microdosing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a period of rebuilding afterwards, and it's a sensitive time. and that is why the environment is important, and that is why your relationships are important. Yeah. Chap in the glasses.
In my mind, the psychedelic experience is nothing like a psychosis, even though it might seem psychotomimetic from the outside. But my question is, how do you relate the second question that you put up there? And I'm thinking, what are your thoughts on delusional psychosis versus being able to, I don't know, change your templates or challenge your templates?
Well, I think a delusion is a fixed template.
Yeah.
I think it's if you like, it's a resistance to an attempt to change the brain to change itself.
And so how do you relate those two different states, psychedelic state from the psychotic state? In my mind, the psychotic state is a state of fixed, or like you said, it's a fixed state rather than a changing state.
Yeah, sure. So I totally get what you mean. Psychosis encompasses a whole range of symptoms. Delusions being one of them. But now I don't think that the psychosis that I am referring to here is necessarily exemplified by delusions, but more about the conceptual desegregation and the ego dissolution that we also see in acute psychosis. The blurring of boundaries between things that we would normally segregate in our minds, boundaries in our mind. That to me is the link between psychosis and the psychedelic experience. Now, psychosis is imbued with all sorts of negative contexts, and it's understandable why, but it shouldn't be. It's just a descriptive term. But the psychedelic experience only subsumes a small amount of psychosis. I agree with you. There are other psychotic symptoms that don't fit into the psychedelic experience. Although sometimes people in psychedelic states do develop temporary delusions. Although by definition, therefore, it's not a delusion. You know, delusion is a fixed belief that stays. So I understand what you're saying, but yeah, that's how I'd rationalise the two.
There's Robin, I think that both Robin and David Matthews, they published a paper in which they draw more similarities to REM sleep than psychosis, and that would be a better representation of what the psychedelic state would be. And
dreamlike sleep.
That somehow appealed to my notion of what the psychedelic state is.
Yes, I mean, I suppose the only thing I'd say is that in the psychedelic state we're in clear consciousness, clear waking consciousness, which obviously is not really the dream state, as far as I understand it.
Unless you're lucid.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have lucid dreamt before. It's not been quite the same. But I take your point. I mean, they're all altered states of consciousness, aren't they? And I suppose that's the point. I mean, you can think about dreams as perhaps as the mind, the subconscious, trying to force things up, symbolic imagery to the conscious awareness. And that's kind of what we wonder is going on with psychedelics by suppressing the top-down expectation. You're letting the subconscious sort of well up. And then it's about, well, what do you make of that? Well, many people don't make much of their dreams. But I'm sure that there are messages to be had, and I've certainly had messages from my dreams. But the first step of that is being sensitive to it and being willing to look. And that, for me, is a little bit about what psychedelic therapy represents. It's the turning inward and the being interested in all the weirdness and wonderfulness of your brain, and making friends with it. It sounds really cheesy, but, it's the only brain you're going to get. So you may as well have a good relationship with it. Yeah.
I want to continue with this with psychosis. In 2014 there was a study linking psychotic traits being much more prevalent in comedians.
Yeah.
Yeah. And could you muse a little bit about the perhaps connection between
well, I mean,
generate comedy and psychedelic traits?
They make the connections that we would hesitate to make, but which, if we let our minds do so, they might make for themselves, and that perhaps that's why they're funny.
Can I just make a quick comment on that?
Yeah.
I just read a study about that stand-up comedians have about the highest IQ, like if you compare different professions, like the lawyers and doctors and so on. Really high IQ.
And there's the Norwegian study linking, or finding the inverse proportion of people who use psychedelics tend to be more mentally healthy than people who don't.
I didn't cover those studies. There are population studies in that link, but they associate use of psychedelics with reduced distress, need for psychiatric medication, that sort of thing. I know Phil wants to round this off now. Do we have time for one?
Can I just
maybe?
add a couple?
Yeah, go nuts.
Yeah.
I just really wanted to add a couple of words about this psychosis track. There was another study. I mean, the link between psychosis and creativity has been known for many, many years.
Yeah.
Decades. You know, in psychoanalytic community, I mean, there were some kind of like radical opinions that claiming that the main difference between a genius and a psychotic individual is that the former can just make more sense out of his or her experience. And I mean, it may sound a bit bizarre, but I mean, if you think about it, you know, there is simply something about it. So recent studies, I mean, it has been also known that creative professions have higher frequency of psychiatric conditions, including psychosis, major depression, bipolar affective disorder. And excitingly, a recent study also co-authored by people from KI, by the way, from Karolinska Institute, clearly demonstrated this link between creativity and psychosis at the genetic level. I'm not going deep into the details, but long story short, so they built a model based on multiple genes to predict the risk of psychosis, and then they applied the model on the healthy population who do not have psychotic episodes. So what they found was quite remarkable. They found that those who scored higher according to that model, they were more likely to have creative professions like they were more likely to be people like musicians, writers. I mean, the paper got criticized for a crude assessment of creativity, but I mean, I think it's in a way strengthful this study that even with such a crude measure, they see the link. Yeah. I think it's quite amazing.
I mean, look at William Blake. You know, society judged him to be mad. Now society judges him to be a genius. He's still the same guy. What's changed? Society's perception, I think, is the sliver of difference between those who are mad and those who are geniuses. Maybe we should end on that.
Yeah. I think this is a really interesting discussion, and I would like to go on, but I also want you all to talk to each other. So I suggest that those of you who want to continue this discussion, just come forward, hang out with James. I'm going to turn on a little bit of music. Please take more coffee, get some dessert. It's probably more food, more hummus. And just hang around and get to know each other. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, James.